Our next speaker is Jenann Ismael. She is a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. She moved there from the University of Arizona after a PhD at Princeton. Her areas of specialization are philosophy of physics, metaphysics, philosophy of science, and the philosophy of mind. She has written 3 books: Essays on Symmetry in 2001, The Situated Self, 2007, and this one I really should read, How Physics Makes Us Free, from 2016. So let's welcome Jenann. Thank you.
So first, just thanks so much for having me. I'm really absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk fast just to leave a little bit of time. There was so much that was rich in Evan's essay and also in the ION essay that I'll be reacting to here. I think the first thing to say is most of this for me is trying to sort out whether I agree or whether I don't. When Evan says it, I think I want to nod, but it sounds very different when I say it in my own voice. So I think I'm going to be cautious about saying I agree or disagree, and just try to be the voice of someone who I think whose instincts are kind of scientific materialist. So I take it, let me just make sure. So I take it that the blind spot essay was meant as a kind of provocation, and so what I'm going to do is kind of go through it and note some of the places where I'm unsure exactly what they're suggesting. I want to grant at the outset that, of course, there are a lot of legitimate complaints about a popular image of science, one that's encouraged indeed by a lot of the ways that physicists, for example, speak, and implicit certainly in the way that physics is invoked in philosophical contexts. So let's just agree not to argue about that, but let's talk among ourselves about whether there's in fact a better way of understanding what physics is up to that's not subject to their complaints. So I've always just approached physics as though it was continuous with the human quest for self-understanding and providing us with a view of ourselves and our position in the cosmos that can help us understand our own experience. So I'm going to be a voice, again, of someone whose instincts are kind of at odds with the spirit of their essay, although, again, I'm not sure where exactly the rubber hits the road if there are deep disagreements here. So let's start just with this. This comes from the ION essay. Many of us like to think that science gives us a view of a complete objective description of cosmic history, distinct from us in our perception of it, but this image of science is deeply flawed in our urge for knowledge and control we've created, and you heard some of this from Evan already. Science has a series of discoveries about how reality is in itself a God's eye view of nature. So I'm going to raise the question of what this distinct from us and our perception of it means, arguing instead that it's in fact inclusive of us and our perception, but given in terms that are invariant under transformations between perspectives. Okay. So here's their explication of the view they oppose. In philosophical terms, scientific materialism combines scientific objectivism. Science tells us about the real mind-independent world, and physicalism. Science tells us that physical reality is all there is, elementary particles, moments in time, genes in the brain. All of these are assumed to be fundamentally real. By contrast, experience, awareness, consciousness are taken to be secondary. The scientific task becomes about figuring out how to reduce them to something physical, such as the behavior of neural networks, the architecture of computational systems, or some measure of information. Okay, so again, you just heard this from Evan. First, I think it's much more natural to think of physicalism as simply the denial that there is anything supernatural in an objective catalog of what there is. Okay. Second, the sense in which experience, awareness, etc. are secondary is that they're not fundamental in the ontological ordering. There are clearly other orderings, the epistemic, maybe the evaluative, the first personal perspective, in which they're primary. And the hermeneutic task is to do what Abner Shimoni sometimes described as closing the circle, that is to say, to bring those two orderings together into a consistent package. Third, I think that when this is properly understood, it's less about reducing experience to something physical than locating it in the physical world or locating it in the world as described by physics. Now, the first and the third points here are related because physicalism should be understood as an inclusive doctrine, rather than an exclusive one. It doesn't deny the reality of experience, but it rather includes it in saying that physical reality is all there is. It is also saying, since our experience is the starting point of physics, that our experience is part of physical reality. The second and the third points are also related. I have no doubt that philosophers have thought that closing the circle demands reduction and offered models of reduction that end up looking crudely exclusive. The expectation that there should be an a priori, content-preserving, epistemically transparent reduction is one that's made explicit in a lot of the arguments that are offered against physicalism in various settings, in particular, I think most explicit in the discussion of consciousness. And there are good reasons, I think, to reject that model of reduction, to reject that idea of what it means for experience to be included. Experience is a starting point of physics. I agree with that. It's implicated in every stage of theory production and confirmation. If we really want to understand what physics tells us about our experience and how our experience is included in the world as described by physics, a better strategy would be to actually look at how experience is recovered and what it means from the perspective of physics to achieve empirical adequacy for a theory. Okay? So I'm going to spend the time talking about how closing the circle works, okay? And what it tells us about the relationship between lived experience and physics. I agree that we don't yet have a good analytic understanding of that relationship, but I think that that's sort of the job of philosophers. That's the hermeneutic task. And it's just wrong to think that physics has somehow been seduced, physics itself has been somehow seduced by the mirage of a God's eye view into forgetting about experience. Okay? So I'm going to start by talking about time, as they do in their essay, and say a few things about consciousness. I won't get a chance to talk about the other of the three scientific conundra that they identify in their essay, time, consciousness, and the nature of matter, and they see all of those as connected to the blind spot. The question about the nature of matter seems to me a rather different kettle of fish, but you know, I'm sure it will come up over the course of the workshop. So here's how closing the circle works. Again, goes without saying, all of this is very schematic and sort of, broad brush stroke. But there's a path outward and there's a path inward, and the two paths have to come together. So the way out, the path outward starts from experience and it ends with ontology. It's an epistemic count of how experience, treated as a source of information about the world, becomes objectified and used to build a theory of what the world is like. The way inward is an account internal to the theory that starts from the ontology provided by the theory and recovers our experience. Okay? It says how creatures like us arise, how we are situated in the world, how our interaction, the sort of tight coupled perceptual interaction and practical interaction with the environment gives rise to our experience in a way that ends up underwriting our use of our experience as evidence for the theory. So this kind of story is anti-foundationalist because the second part, the account of our epistemic interaction with the world, is entirely internal to a theory. But it's not vicious because there's no way to guarantee that we'll be able to recover our experience starting from a given ontology. Everybody who's done a little physics knows how hard that is. Okay, now the path outward has two aspects. There's a kind of development in the direction of increasing depth and increasing objectivity. Objectivity is a matter of abstracting from features of our perspective, and depth is a matter of peeling back the layers of physical structure and revealing the physical processes that underlie the manifest structure of the world. So if we're talking about time, there's a lot of really beautiful physics that's really come into focus, I think, probably in the last century and a half, involved in the process of kind of going deep. That is to say, uncovering the layers of physical structure that underlie the kind of manifest temporal asymmetries of the macroscopic fabric of the world that we couple to directly. I'm going to ignore that here. And just focus instead on the process of objectification, because this is the part of the story that I think is most philosophically contested and most directly connected to the blind spot. So if you look at the philosophical wars about time. It's a battle between two sides. There's the friends of becoming on the one hand, and then there's the block universe enthusiasts on the other. Friends of becoming hold something like that the universe is open-ended and ongoing, that its future is not fixed by its past, that it's always in the process of coming into being and never forms a completed totality. Block universe enthusiasts insist that there is no becoming. What there is just a four-dimensional manifold of events that comes into view in stages and for people whose lives are embedded in it. Now, the imaginative picture that goes along with the block universe, it comes from physics, where it's kind of common practice to create low-dimensional representations of the manifold. The four-dimensional manifold, 3 dimensions are spatial, 1-dimensional is time-like. So create these low-dimensional representations that we can look down at. And the reason for that practice is that these low-dimensional representations display causal structure, they convey geometric content. The geometric content is all about higher-order relationships, that is to say, relationships between elements, moments in time, or parts of time that are never, in fact, presented simultaneously to us. Friends of becoming hold that the four-dimensional picture comes with the disappearance of everything that we think of as essential to time and everything that we experience as essential to time, time as we know it in our experience. They say there's no change or flow, the manifold is just a static object. Okay, so that's kind of the conflict as it appears in a lot of the philosophical discussion of time, and there's a deflationary attitude about all of this that holds that the four-dimensional representation is just the same kind of semantic, the result of the same kind of semantic assent that you affect when you write down a timeline. Okay? You simply represent the temporal relations among events, leaves all of the internal relations between those events intact, the first-order properties and their first-order properties. Philosophically, this kind of semantic assent has analytic import. It allows us to separate objective come perspectival or implicitly relational objective come invariant content from what's implicitly relativized or perspectival. Anytime we have a structure in which we represent things in a way that's implicitly relativized to an element in that structure or a location in that structure, we can de-relativize by explicitly representing the parameter relative to which other elements are related. So the spatial case, I mean, if this sounds unfamiliar, it's actually very familiar to you. We all make use of it instinctively in the spatial case. That's the most familiar one. When you draw a map, you abstract from your location and you simply represent the spatial relationships to the other points in space. We can do it in other ways too. You can represent the members of a family on a tree-like structure. When you locate yourself on the tree, that is, you say which element in that tree represents you. Right? That will determine who your aunts, uncles, grandparents, and sisters are. It will, that is to say, order everybody else represented on their tree by their relationships to you. If you locate yourself on a status hierarchy, that will determine who falls above and who falls below you. Again, the objective description of the structure here tends to be phenomenologically and practically inert. It's a self-locating information, right, that determines what you should expect to see and how you should act. So someone's relation to me in a family tree will carry implications for who I should expect to see in my house, for example. Someone's relation to me in a status hierarchy might encode a set of norms of interaction. And obviously, when you locate yourself on a point of space, on a map of space, that tells you what you should expect to see around you and how you should act if you want to get to somewhere. Okay. Now, this structure here, that kind of de-relativization and self-location, is abstract and general. There's a separation of implicitly relativized representations into an invariant and a self-locating component. All of what we think of as the perspectival aspects are represented in relational terms. on the objective structure and recovered from self-location. Okay. You can see how it gets generalized in each of these cases. So far we've talked, though, just about static examples. We talked about self-locating on a map, self-locating on a timeline, saying which moment on a timeline is now, self-locating on a family tree or a status hierarchy. But we can also look at how those structures change over time. And here we'll see two dimensions of change, where the relational structure is changing over time. So in the case of a family tree, for example, people have children, get married, get divorced, so the tree-like structure changes, although your location on it doesn't change. Okay? There's a different case where the relational structure is fixed, but the self-locating element changes. So in the case of a static hierarchy, that keeps track of your location as you're promoted. So there the status hierarchy stays the same, but your position in it changes. Or GPS, obviously, that tracks your position against a fixed landscape. And of course, there can be mixtures of these two types of change, as when you're moving through a changing landscape and using changes in your experience as a guide to both. Okay. Or you're a teenager in high school trying to keep track of your situation in a social hierarchy, carefully solving sort of social cues for whether the landscape has altered or whether your position has changed. Why am I being treated differently? Have I done something? Has there been some social upheaval that I don't know about? Okay. Now, all of the so-called A-series properties of moments, so that's kind of philosophical terminology that refers to properties of moments or properties of events, that is spatiotemporally localized elements that change over time. So things like whether an event is past or future, whether an event is fixed or open, whether an event is still possible or no longer possible. Okay. Those are represented as relations to different temporal perspectives. Okay. On precise formal analogy, with the way that one represents relations like being near or being far away, as relations to particular places in explicit representations of space. So properties of places that change when you move, like whether they're near, whether they're far away. Properties, that is to say, are not invariant under changes in your location. Okay. Those are the ones that are implicitly relativized to your location. In colloquial terms, those are the ones that are perspectival. Okay. And just so, properties of events that change over time, properties that are not invariant under shifts in your perspective on time, things like whether an event is past or future, whether it's fixed or open, those are implicitly relativized to your temporal location or the temporal perspective from which you judge. Okay. Now, it's not trivial that there is a kind of non-trivial factorization into an invariant and a self-locating, into invariant and self-locating content. Our brains do that sort of factorization for us automatically when we're sort of, when we're given images. If you're given a random collection of snapshots of a stadium from different locations, your brain will sort of solve for you how to piece those together into a three-dimensional representation of a place seen from different locations in it. But if you were given a mathematical encoding of a two-dimensional array of colors, that describes the surface of those snapshots, it would be a very difficult problem, a very difficult mathematical problem to see how to recover the full collection as views of a higher dimensional space from different locations in it. The same goes for time. It's a highly non-trivial fact about that we can organize our memories by thinking of them as views of the same events from different temporal perspectives. That's a highly non-trivial fact about the relations between the representations from different moments in time. Now, the separation of self-locating and invariant content isn't in conflict with a kind of scientific worldview. It arises naturally from within it. It is, in fact, what makes science possible. The first step away from solipsism is being able to separate information about the world from information about your form of sensory access to it. And the first step towards being able to integrate experience acquired at different times and different places is a separation of information about the world from information about one's temporal and spatial position in it. Now, go back to the debate between Friends of Becoming and Defenders of the Block Universe. Most of the debate between them has focused on things like the status of flow and the status of passage. And those who have had the sort of deflationary attitude that I mentioned, where you think of what's really going on when you represent time as one dimension of a four-dimensional manifold as just a kind of semantic assent, so people like Craig Callender, Hugh Price, Carlo Rovelli, Sean Carroll, have worked to show how those things, passage and flow, can be recovered once they're made precise enough to kind of permit treatment. Passage and flow get recovered as products of the changing perspective of the mind of an agent, representing the world from different temporal points of view, and then remembering those relations. Fixity and openness, the sense that the past is fixed and the future is open, those are much less commonly discussed, though they're absolutely essential to the ordinary person's lived experience of time. To recover those in this setting, I think we need to dig a little deeper and introduce an internal distinction between, an internal, I mean psychologically internal to the stream of lived experience, between change that you perceive and change that you produce. First, though, let me make a quick qualification. So usually when we use a map, we have a user. That is, and the user is a kind of bridge that relates the map to the space in which the map is situated. But we can actually get rid of the user as an essential third element by using fixed points, like the red dot on a map. Now, the red dot usually has the attached phrase, and we usually read it as saying, you are here. Right? But its content is actually, I am here, where the I refers to the map itself. Okay? In identifying the point on a map that represents its own location in space, what the red dot is doing is it's sort of bridging two orders. On the one hand, there's the internal representational space of the map, and then there's the external space in which the map is situated. And in that way, what the red dot is doing is relating the representation to what it represents. Okay? If we wanted to put that in technical terms, we could say that it's identifying a fixed point in the representational relation. Okay? And that's quite general. Anytime we have a structure every time we have a representation that's situated in the space it represents, or a structure that is an element of the, or a structure, or situated is an element of the structure that it represents, it can self-locate in that structure. So let me say that again since I boggled it. Anytime we have a representation that is situated in the space or is an element of the structure that it represents, it can self-locate in that structure. And the self-locating element, the element that says, here I am, or this is me, identifies a fixed point. Okay? So when I talk about self-location in time, okay, you shouldn't be thinking in terms of a separate object, the self, moving through a spatio-temporally extended landscape, but rather in terms of a connected stream of representational states, perceptions, thoughts, hopes, and dreams, itself extended in time, locating themselves in an objective temporal map of the world. So I am here, this is now, affirmed and reaffirmed from different points along a stream. Okay. So once we have this in place, we can reintroduce I as a first personal pronoun to mean something like the proper subject of this connected stream of introspectively accessible states. But we want to be careful here not to slip into thinking of that as an object. Motion is having different positions in time. Nothing moves through time. So you don't want to kind of reintroduce that picture of an object moving through time. That way lies incoherence. So now let's go back to fixity and openness, the sense that the future is open and the past is fixed, and that internal distinction between change we perceive and change we produce. We all act in the domain that we are predicting. In that way, our bodily movements, and then by extension, our thoughts and our experiences, are integrated into the causal order. The change that we produce at one stage is perceived at the next, and the cycle of acting and perceiving the results of our action is central to the phenomenology of time, the lived phenomenology of the world, and central to the idea that the world, and not just our experience of it, is in production. That cycle of acting and then perceiving the results of your action is what gives direction to the flow and keeps us from thinking that the future is sort of already there, just kind of coming into view in stages. The fact that we create some of the change we perceive makes us think of the future as not just coming into view, but coming into being. Now, with all of this in place, again, apologies for the schematic character, but we can begin to see dimly, but not, but well enough, hopefully, the sort of complex information processing task that the mind faces. It's representing the world on the one hand in spatially and temporally objective terms, creating a map and a timeline on which it stores the information picked up from different times and places. It's being fed a stream of experience. It processes the information in the stream by factoring changes in experience into changes in the world on the one hand, and changes in one's own position in it on the other, storing the information about the world on a kind of map and a developing timeline, and then using the results as the basis for a decision procedure geared to producing positive change. And all of this is ongoing. Okay. And I hope you can begin to see how the temporal aspects of lived experience get captured in the changing contents of the resulting stream. We have to attend here not just to the kind of objective and developing map of space and time, but also to the self-locating element, the sort of the here now, that locates this thought and that experience over and over at different points along the stream. And to look at how that self-locating element changes, ordering and reordering the events in that sort of objective map of time and space by their relationships to the now over the course of an ordinary life. Okay. Now, the point of all of this is not so much that the temporal aspects are left out, as that they're recovered from the inside, as connected to the changing temporal perspective of a creature that's representing the world from different spatial and temporal perspectives over the course of its own history. Now, we all know, or maybe not all of you, anybody who's read this literature knows this sort of famous quote from Herman Weyl. He says, "The objective world simply is. It does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness crawling upward along the lifeline of my body does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image of space which continually changes in time." Now, the trick, everybody recognizes that there's something right about the structure of this image as capturing the sense of our experience, our changing perspective on time. The trick to interpreting the image without falling into the sort of incoherent idea of an object that moves through time is to see what Weyl is here referring to as the gaze of my consciousness as effectively a fixed point. At every point along an experiential stream, there's some piece of the stream itself that's there, that's presented rather than merely represented, or on display, the red dots identifying which thoughts and experience play that role at different times. Okay. And this brings us to something else that's often said to be left out of an objective physical description of the world. So I said that at every moment there's some bit of the experiential stream that is on display or present to itself. By that I meant that it's presented rather than merely represented and can be made the object of a reflexive act of consciousness. Okay. So normally we're focused on, the hummingbirds are just for a distraction. My husband takes these pictures, so I promise him that I'll put him on there. So normally we're focused on the information that they carry rather than the experiences themselves, but we can turn our attention to the perceptual states themselves, as we do when we're, for example, trying to figure out a taste, or at the doctor's office trying to describe our symptoms, and we can make them the objects of attention. Now, there are three sort of observations to make here. Any thought or experience that's internal to a particular stream can be made objects of thoughts internal to that stream. Okay? When that is done, its qualitative properties are sort of presented or displayed rather than merely represented or described, like here where we don't just describe but present a collection of colors and then attach a description to them. Those qualitative properties can be associated with physically described states of some brain, and physics represents those states in phenomenologically neutral terms, and the gap between the qualitatively rich experience as it's presented to itself in thought and the qualitatively neutral brain state has been used to argue that phenomenal states cannot be identical to brain states. So now taking these in turn, now the first is a familiar enough idea. When I'm focusing on a familiar taste that I can't pin down, and I have the thought, what is this? Is this truffle? Is it something else? Right? The experience itself is part of the content of the thought. And its properties are not just referred to, but themselves made part of the content of the thought. Two is also familiar. So these associations between something that's displayed and something that's and an objective physical description are famously accomplished in thoughts like, this is what it's like to see red, or this is what it's like to taste uni. A little more explicitly, this is what it's like for me when my brain is in the state typically caused by looking at something red, or that's induced by eating uni. Okay? Now, three, you all know sort of the collection of now canonical dualist arguments that say that there's nothing in the physical description or the brain state that suggests that any state so described has a phenomenology, or what that phenomenology is. So I just want to point out here that physics describes brain states in qualitatively or phenomenologically neutral terms because the phenomenal impact that those states have is relational. Objective here just means invariant under transformations between first-personal perspectives. And no state of any brain, characterized in purely physical terms, has a phenomenology in absolute terms. It's always your brain state, or your brain being in a certain state, that has a phenomenology for you, my brain being in a certain state, or my brain whose states have a phenomenology, an immediate phenomenology for me. Indeed, what makes this brain mine is that it's the one whose states are immediately linked to what's happening in here, in my mind, in my experiential stream now. Okay. The ultimate acts of self-location are mapping these thoughts and experiences into the causal structure or the causal order described by physics. And I do that by linking them with the states of a certain brain right now. And if having a phenomenology is a matter of being presented rather than merely represented, it's not surprising that there are thoughts that only I can have about an experience, and only at the time at which it occurs, because only I can make it a constituent of my thoughts, and only while it is happening. Okay. Notice now that if we just described things in terms of causal states mediating perception and action in publicly observable bodies, there's no real philosophical disagreement. My psychological life, these thoughts and experiences, mediates perception and action in this body, controlled by what's happening to its sensory surfaces and controlling its voluntary movements. Yours mediates perception and action in another body. Right? And functionally, the thoughts that associate our inner lives, respectively, with events that mediate perception and action in different bodies, play the role of self-location. They locate us in the causal order described by physics, the causal order that we all, so that we can all identify, bridging two orders, events internal to a stream of consciousness with occurrences in the public landscape. Okay, that much I think is agreed on almost all hands. All of the philosophical disagreement arises, when we try to translate these implicitly defined causal states, events mediating the perception and action pathways in a particular body, mediating the perception to action pathways in different bodies into an explicit description of what plays that role given in physical terms. The canonical arguments for dualism are supposed to establish that the qualitatively rich internal events internal to a stream of consciousness cannot be identical to brain states, that it must be some weaker association, like causal or nomological determination. Okay. Now, there's a whole lot to say about those arguments, and I'm sure they'll come up again. You all know the arguments. I just want you to reflect on the expectation that we should be able to read the phenomenology off of physical description. Okay. Because the qualitative or phenomenological impact of an event described in physical terms is relational, physics is going to have to represent events in a phenomenologically neutral way. The connection between phenomenological properties and physical description is going to have to be made within a stream of consciousness by linking events that are presented in that stream with representations of them. Okay? And I don't think now, I grant, clearly now we don't have any very good understanding of the general conditions under which there is experience. The kind of rich phenomenology that creatures like us have, that is, creatures that can raise questions about their own experience, is tied to the existence of an introspective perspective, a sequestered inner life with a certain amount of representational structure that can take its own states as objects and that communicates with other creatures, communicates with the environment and with other creatures in the environment through external channels. I do think, though, that simply because of the logic of these relationships, the fact that phenomenal content is relational, that the phenomenal content is only available to the subject because only she can have thoughts that take those states, have thoughts with her experiences as constituents and only while she is having them. It is confused to think that we should be able to extract phenomenological content when anything is represented in third personal terms. That doesn't mean that our theories aren't representationally complete. Okay? Physics represents what experience presents. It describes the whole causal network in which one's own inner events are connected, and it does that in phenomenologically neutral terms. Is this sort of position neutral monism? Is it a dual property view? Is it physicalism with an epistemic dimension? I actually don't know. I think this is an area that's gotten so articulated with with positions and burdened with philosophical commitments, from everything about the individuation of concepts to the nature of identity and the epistemology of zombies, that maybe it's better just to be quietist, to recognize that it's enough for physics to locate introspectively accessible states in the causal order, to connect introspectively available phenomenology to events that are represented in third personal terms, not worry about reducing the phenomenology, and get on with it. Okay. So let me bring this back to the idea of closing the circle. I have one more paragraph. Is that Recall that I said that there's a path outward and a path inward, and they have to come together into a mutually supporting package. The way out is this sort of epistemic account of how experience, treated as a source of information about a public landscape, becomes objectified and used to build a theory of what the world is like. The way inward is an ontological story, told in third-personal terms, provided by the theory of how creatures like us arise in our epistemic interaction with the environment that recovers our experience from within. These two things, there are two things that are really important about the circle imagery here, and that make it very different from the God's eye view. One is that it makes it clear that there is no absolute ordering. There are different orderings, epistemic and ontological, and the same elements are represented on both. Experience is primary on the epistemic ordering, and somewhere in the middle in the ontological ordering. Quantum fields, or maybe strings or loops, are fundamental in the ontological ordering, and far from that in the epistemic ordering. The second thing, and this is the last one, is that the resulting structure is not a God's eye view of a static landscape viewed from the outside. It's a dynamic image of an evolving landscape viewed from the inside, reflected in the lived experience of creatures whose lives are woven into and partly guide or channel its development. Okay. Maybe it would be better to think of it as something like this if we put this in motion and represented it in four-dimensional terms and then wrote down a timeline of its history. Thank you. No time?
One question, of course. Yes, sure, please.
Jenann, as each time your presentation is very exciting and challenging. However, I would like to draw a conclusion. I would like to know if you agree that the problem is not the blind spot of science, but a blind spot of a misconception of science. Namely, a conception of science in which you posit a sort of block universe and you want to extract phenomenology out of it. Instead, you said the right conception is to locate an abstract sign of our experience in it. Yet, I think that, the tendency in history of science, and especially of physics, is precisely to make the misunderstanding. Namely, you start with Einstein's special relativity with this idea of positions, perspectives, and so on, and you jump into a completely reified picture of a block universe, of the block universe of general relativity, in which you think this is reality and I no longer enter into it. And it's the case everywhere, especially in quantum physics. So I think the point is to realize that there is a wrong move not to make in science, and to have a sort of prudence about its status.
100% agree with that, except with the use of we and you in it. I mean, I think, that's why I said absolutely, that image is out there. It's made use of in philosophy all the time, and it recurs in physics. And it's absolutely worth correcting. And I think the ion essay was a great sort of venue for that. Part of the spirit of this is, though, to see whether there is some middle ground here that can be mutually agreed by the people who are actually trying to make sense of how it is that lived experience appears in physics.